Okay, let's carry on where we left off, which I believe is part 4, the withering away of the state and violent revolution. Engel's words regarding the withering away of the state are so widely known, they are often quoted and so clearly reveal the essence of the customary adaptation of Marxism to opportunism that we must deal with them in detail. We shall quote the whole argument from which they are taken. Just ignore the cap. The proletariat seizes from state power and turns the means of production into state property to begin with. But thereby it abolishes itself as the proletariat and abolishes all class distinctions and class antagonisms, and abolishes also the state as state. Okay. Society thus far operating amid class antagonisms needed the state, that is, an organization of the particular exploiting class, for maintenance of its external conditions of product, and therefore especially for the purpose of forcibly keeping the exploited class in conditions of oppression determined by the given mode of production: slavery, serfdom, or bondage, or wage labor. The state was the official representatives of society as a whole, its concentration in a visible corporation, but it was this only insofar as it was the state of that class which in itself represented for its own time, society as a whole. In ancient times, the state of slave-owning citizens in the Middle Ages of the feudal nobility, in our own time of the bourgeoisie. When at last it becomes the real representative of the whole of society, it renders itself unnecessary. As soon as there is no longer any social class to be held in subjection, as soon as class rule and the individual struggle for independence based upon the present anarchy in production, with the collisions and excesses arising from this struggle, are removed, nothing more remains to be held in subjection, nothing necessitating a special coercive force, a state. The first act by which the state really comes forward as the representative of the whole of society, taking possession of the means of production in the name of society, is also its last independent act as a state. State interference in social relations becomes, in one domain after another, superfluous, and then dies down itself. The government of persons is replaced by the administration of things. And by the conduct of processes of production, the state is not abolished, it withers away. This gives a measure of the value of the phrase a free people's state. But as to its justifiable use for a long time from an agitational point of view, and as so to its ultimate scientific insufficiency, and also of the so-called anarchists, demand that the state be abolished overnight. Herr Eugen Düring's Revolution in Science, Anti-Düring. I gotta get that one day too and read that. Anyway, it is safe to say that of this argument of Engels, which is so remarkably rich in ideas, only one point has become an integral part of socialist thought among the modern socialist parties, namely that according to Marx, that states wither away, as distinct from the anarchist doctrine of abolition of the state. To prune Marxism to such an extent means reducing it to opportunism. For this interpretation only leaves a vague notion of a slow, even gradual change, of absences of leaps and storms, of absence of revolution. The current widespread popular, if one may say so, conception of the withering away of the state undoubtedly means obscuring, if not repudiating, revolution. Basically, anarchists messing it up again. Such an interpretation, however, is the crudest distortion of Marxism, advantageous only to the bourgeoisie. In point of theory, it is based on disregard for the most important circumstances and considerations indicated in, say, Engels' summary argument, which we have just quoted in full. In the first place, at the very outset of his argument, Engels says that in seizing state power, the proletariat thereby abolishes the state as state. It is not done to ponder over the meaning of this. Generally, it is either ignored altogether or is considered to be something in the nature of Hegelian weakness on Engels' part. As a matter of fact, however, these words briefly express the experience of one of the greatest proletarian revolutions, the Paris Commune of 1871, of which we shall speak in greater detail in its proper place. As a matter of fact, Engels speaks here of the proletariat revolution abolishing the bourgeois state, while the words about the state withering away refer to the remnants of the proletarian state after the socialist revolution. According to Engels, the bourgeois state does not wither away, but is abolished by the proletariat in the course of the revolution. What withers away after this revolution is the proletarian state or semi-state. Secondly, the state is a special coercive force. Engels gives this splendid and extremely profound definition here with the utmost lucidity. And from it follows that the special coercive force for the suppression of the proletariat by the bourgeoisie of millions of working people by handfuls of the rich must be replaced by a special coercive force for the suppression of the bourgeoisie by the proletariat, dictatorship of the proletariat. This is precisely what is meant by the abolition of the state as state. This is precisely the act of taking possession of the means of production in the name of society. And it is self-evident that such a replacement of one bourgeois special force by another proletarian special force cannot possibly take place in the form of withering away. Thirdly, in speaking of the state withering away, and even more graphic and colorful dying down of itself, Engels refers quite clearly and definitely to the period after the state has taken possession of the means of production in the name of the whole of society. That is, after the socialist revolution. We all know that the political form of the state at that time is the most complete democracy. But it never enters the head of any of the opportunists who shamelessly distort Marxism that Engels is consequently speaking here of democracy dying down of itself or withering away. This seems very strange at first sight, but is incomprehensible only to those who have not thought about democracy also being a state, and consequently also disappearing when the state disappears. Here we go. Revolution alone can abolish the bourgeois state. The state in general, i.e., the most complete democracy, can only wither away. Fourthly, after formulating his famous proposition that the state withers away, Engels at once explains specifically that this proposition is directed against both the opportunists and the anarchists. Both the same thing in my opinion, but in doing this, Engels puts in the forefront that conclusion drawn from the proposition that the state withers away, which is directed against the opportunists. One can wager that out of every 10,000 persons who have read or heard about the withering away of the state, 9,990 are completely unaware or do not remember that Engels directed his conclusions from that proposition not against the anarchists alone. So we can't just dab on anarchists. Okay, fair enough. And of the remaining 10, probably 9 do not know the meaning of a free people's state, or why an attack on this slogan means an attack on opportunists. This is how history is written. This is how a great revolutionary teaching is imperceptibly falsified and adapted to prevailing Philistinism. The conclusion directed against the anarchists has been repeated thousands of times. It has been vulgarized and rammed into people's heads in the shallowest form. and has acquired the strength of a prejudice, whereas the conclusion directed against the opportunists has been obscured and forgotten. The Free People's State was a program demand and a catchword current among the German Social Democrats in the 70s, referring to the 1870s. This catchword is devoid of all political content except that it describes the concept of democracy in a pompous Philistine fashion, insofar as it hinted in a legally permissible manner at a democratic republic. Engels was prepared to justify its use for a time from an agitational point of view, but it was an opportunist catchword, for it amounted to something more than the prettifying of bourgeois democracy. It gussied it up. Yeah, gussied up. I'll just use gussied up. It just sounds better. Make me sound more redneck, but yeah, that's all right. Bourgeois democracy, and was also failure to understand the socialist criticism of the state in general. We are in favor of a democratic republic as the best form of state for the proletariat under capitalism. But we have no right to forget that wage slavery is the lot of the people, even in the most democratic bourgeois republic. Furthermore, every state is a special force for the suppression of the oppressed class. Consequently, every state is not free and not a people's state. Marx and Engels explained this repeatedly to their party comrades in the 70s. Fifthly, the same work of Engels, whose arguments are about the withering away of the state, everyone remembers, also contains an argument of the significance of violent revolution. Engels' historical analysis of its role becomes a veritable panegyric on violent revolution. This no one remembers. It is not done in modern socialist parties to talk or even think about the significance of this idea, and it plays no part whatever in their daily propaganda and agitation amongst the people. And yet, it is inseparably bound up with the withering away of the state into one harmonious whole. Here is Engels' argument. That force, however, plays yet another role other than that of a diabolical power in history, a revolutionary role that, in the words of Marx, is the midwife of every old society which is pregnant with a new one, that it is the instrument with which social movement forces its way through and shatters the dead, fossilized political forms. Of this, there is not a word in Herr Dühring. Sorry. It is only with sighs and groans that he admits the possibility that force will perhaps be necessary for the overthrow of an economy based on exploitation. Unfortunately, because all use of force demoralizes, he says the person who uses it. And this in Germany, where a violent collusion, which may, after all, be forced on the people, would at least have the advantage of wiping out the servility which has penetrated the nation's mentality following the humiliation of the 30 Years' War. And this person's mode of thought, dull, insipid, and impotent, presumes that to impose itself on the most revolutionary party that history has ever known. How is this panegyric on violent revolution, which Engels insistently brought to the attention of the German Social Democrats between 1878 and 1894, i.e., right up to the time of his death, be combined with the theory of the withering away of the state to form a single theory? Usually the two are combined by means of eclecticism, by an unprincipled or sophistic selection made arbitrarily, or to please the powers that be, of the first one, then another argument, and in 99 cases out of 100, if not more, it is the idea of the withering away that is placed at the forefront. Dialectics are replaced by eclecticism. That is the most usual, the most widespread practice to be met within present-day official social democratic literature in relation to Marxism. This sort of substitution is, of course, nothing new. It was observed even in the history of classical Greek philosophy. In falsifying Marxism in opportunist fashion, the substitution of eclecticism for dialectics is the easiest way of deceiving people. It gives an illusory satisfaction. It seems to take into account all sides of the process, all trends of development, all the conflicting influences, and so forth, whereas in reality, it provides no integral and revolutionary conception of the process of social development at all. We have already said above, and shall show more fully later, that the theory of Marx and Engels of the inevitability of a violent revolution refers to the bourgeois state. The latter cannot be superseded by the proletarian state, the dictatorship of the proletariat, through the process of withering away, but as a general rule, only through a violent revolution. The panegyric Engels sang in its honor, and which fully corresponds to Marx's repeated statements, with their proud and open proclamation of the inevitability of a violent revolution. This panegyric is by no means a mere impulse, a mere declamation, or a polemical sally. The necessity of systematically imbuing the masses with this, and precisely this view of violent revolution lies at the root of the entire theory of Marx and Engels. The betrayal of their theory by the now prevailing social chauvinist and Trotskyite trends expresses itself strikingly in both these trends, ignoring such propaganda and agitation. The supersession of the bourgeois state by the proletarian state is impossible without a revolution, a violent revolution. The abolition of the proletarian state, i.e., of the state in general, this is probably okay. I think this is something I think Marx is going to talk about. Or Lenin is going to talk about later on. Maybe I said it wrong when I said, that there's the proletarian state, i.e., of the state in general, is impossible except through the process of withering away. A detailed and concrete elaboration of these views was given by Marx and Engels when they studied each particular revolutionary situation, when they analyzed the lesson of the experience of each particular revolution. We shall now pass to this, undoubtedly the most important part of their theory. The Eve of Revolution, Chapter 2. Actually, Chapter 2 is the experience of 1848 to 1851. Part 1, The Eve of Revolution. The first works of mature Marxism, The Poverty of Philosophy, and the Communist Manifesto, appeared just on the eve of the Revolution of 1848. For this reason, in addition to presenting the general principles of Marxism, they reflect to a certain degree the concrete revolutionary situation of the time. It will, therefore, be more expedient perhaps to examine what the authors of those works said about the state immediately before they drew conclusions from the experience of 1848 to 1851. In The Poverty of Philosophy, Marx wrote, "The working class, in the course of development, will substitute for the old bourgeois society an association which will preclude classes and their antagonism, and there will be no more political power groups, since a political power is precisely the official expression of class antagonism in bourgeois society. It is instructive to compare the general exposition of the idea of the state disappearing after the abolition of classes with the exposition contained in the Communist Manifesto, written by Marx and Engels a few months later, in November 1847, to be exact. In depicting the most general phases of the development of the proletariat, we trace the more or less veiled civil war raging within existing society up to the point where that war breaks out into open revolution, and where the violent overthrow of the bourgeoisie lays the foundation for the sway of the proletariat. We have seen above that the first step of the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of ruling class to win the battle of democracy. The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest, by degree, all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, i.e., of the proletariat organized as the ruling class, and to increase the total productive forces as rapidly as possible." Here we have the formulation of one of the most remarkable and important ideas of Marxism on the subject of the state, namely the idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat, as Marx and Engels began to call it after the Paris Commune, and also a highly interesting definition of the state, which is also one of the forgotten words of Marxism: the state, i.e., the proletariat organized as the ruling class. Dictatorship of the proletariat. This definition of the state has never been explained in the prevailing propaganda and agitation literature of the official social democratic parties. More than that, it has been deliberately ignored, for it is absolutely irreconcilable with reformism and is a slap in the face for the common opportunist prejudices and Philistine illusions about the peaceful development of democracy. The proletariat needs a state. This is repeated by all the opportunists, social chauvinists, and Trotskyites, who assure us that this is what Marx taught, but they forget to add that in the first place, according to Marx, the proletariat needs only a state which is withering away, i.e., a state so constituted that it begins to wither away immediately, and cannot but wither away. And secondly, the working people need the state, i.e., the proletariat organized as the ruling class. The state is a special organization of force. It is an organization of violence for the suppression of some class. What class must the proletariat suppress? Naturally, only the exploiting class, i.e., the bourgeoisie. The working people need the state only to suppress the resistance of the exploiters, and only the proletariat can direct this suppression, can carry it out. For the proletariat is the only class that is consistently revolutionary. The only class that can unite all the working and exploited people in the struggle against the bourgeoisie in completely removing it. The exploiting classes need political rule to maintain exploitation, i.e., in the selfish interest of the insignificant minority against the vast majority of all people. The exploited classes need political rule in order to completely abolish all exploitation, i.e., in the interest of the vast majority of the people, and against the insignificant minority consisting of the modern slave owners, the landowners, and capitalists. The petty bourgeois Democrats, those sham socialists who replaced the class struggle by dreams of class harmony, even pictured the socialist transformation in a dreamy fashion, not as the overthrow of the rule of the exploiting class, but as the peaceful submission of the minority to the majority, which has become aware of its aims. This petty bourgeois utopia, which is inseparable from the idea of the state being above classes, led in practice to the betrayal of the interests of the working classes, as was shown, for example, by the history of the French revolutions of 1848 and 1871, and by the experience of socialist participation in bourgeois cabinets in Britain, France, Italy, and other countries at the turn of the century. Hold on, folks. Okay, folks, sorry about that noise that you heard in there. It was just the usual stuff. It's hard to find a good soundproof room. Anywho, all his life, Marx fought against this petty bourgeois socialism, now revived in Russia by the Socialist, Revolutionary, and Menshevik parties. He developed his theory of class struggle consistently, down to the theory of political power of the state. The overthrow of bourgeois rule can be accomplished only by the proletariat, the particular class whose economic conditions of existence prepare it for this task and provide it with the possibility and power to perform it. While the bourgeois break up and disintegrate the peasantry and all the petty bourgeois groups, they weld together, unite, and organize the proletariat. Only the proletariat, by virtue of the economic role it plays in large-scale production, is capable of being the leader of all the working and exploited people. Whom the bourgeoisie exploit, oppress, and crush, often not less, but more than they do the proletarians, but who are incapable of waging an independent struggle for their emancipation. The theory of class struggle, applied by Marx to the question of the state in the socialist revolution, leads as a matter of course to the recognition of the political rule of the proletariat, of its dictatorship, i.e., of undivided power directly backed by the armed force of the people. The overthrow of the bourgeoisie can be achieved only by the proletariat becoming the ruling class, capable of crushing the inevitable and desperate resistance of the bourgeoisie and of organizing all the working and exploited people for the new economic system. The proletariat needs state power, a centralized organization of force, an organization of violence, both to crush the resistance of the exploiters and to lead the enormous mass of the population, the peasants, the petty bourgeoisie, and semi-proletarians. The lumpen proletariat, I believe, is what he's referring to. In the work of organizing a socialist economy. By educating the Workers' Party, Marxism educates the vanguard of the proletariat capable of assuming power and leading the whole people to do socialism, of directing and organizing the new system, of being the teacher, the guide, the leader of all the working and exploited people in organizing their social life without the bourgeoisie and against the bourgeoisie. By contrast, the opportunism now prevailing trains the members of the Workers' Party to be the representatives of the better paid workers who lose touch with the masses, get along fairly well under capitalism, and sell their birthright for a mass of pottage, i.e., renounce their role as revolutionary leaders of the people against the bourgeoisie. Marxist theory of the state, i.e., the proletariat organized as the ruling class, is inseparably bound up with the whole of his doctrine of revolutionary role of the proletariat in history. The culmination of this rule is the proletarian dictatorship, the political rule of the proletariat. But since the proletariat needs the state as a special form of organization of violence against the bourgeoisie, the following conclusion suggests itself. Is it conceivable that such an organization can be created without first destroying the state machine created by the bourgeoisie for themselves? The Communist Manifesto leads straight to this conclusion, and it is of this conclusion that Marx speaks when summing up the experience of the Revolution of 1848 to 1851. The Revolution summed up. Marx sums up his conclusions of the Revolution of 1848 to 1851 on the subject of the state we are concerned with the following argument contained in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. But the revolution is thoroughgoing. It is still journeying through the purgatory. It does its work methodically. By December 2nd, 1851, the day of Louis Bonaparte's coup d'etat, it had completed one half of its preparatory work. It is now completing the other half. First, it perfected the parliamentary power in order to be able to overthrow it. Now it has attained this. Now it has attained this. It is perfecting the executive power, reducing it to its purest expression, isolating it, setting it up against itself as the sole object, in order to concentrate all its forces of destruction against it. And when it is done the second half of its preliminary work, Europe will leap from its seat and exultantly exclaim, "Well-grubbed old mule." This executive power, with its enormous bureaucratic and military organization, with its vast and ingenious state machinery, with a host of officials numbering 500,000, besides an army of another 500,000, this appalling parasitic body which enmeshes the body of French society and chokes all of its pores, sprang up in the days of the absolute monarchy, with the decay of the feudal system which helped it to hasten. The first French Revolution developed centralization, but at the same time it increased the extent and attributes and the number of agents of governmental power. Napoleon completed this state machinery. The legitimate monarchy and the July monarchy added nothing but the greater division of labor. Finally, in its struggle against the revolution, the parliamentary republic found itself compelled to strengthen, along with repressive measures, the resources and centralization of governmental power. All revolutions perfected this machine instead of smashing it. The parties contended in turn for domination regarded the possession of this huge state edifice as the principal spoils of the victor. In this remarkable argument, Marxism takes a tremendous step forward compared with the Communist Manifesto. In the latter, the question of the state is still treated in an extremely abstract manner, in the most general terms and expressions. In the above quoted passage, the question is treated in a concrete manner, and the conclusion is extremely precise, definite, practical, and palpable. All previous revolutions perfected the state machine, whereas it must be broken, smashed. This conclusion is the chief and fundamental point in the Marxist theory of the state, and it is precisely the fundamental point which has been completely ignored by the dominant official social democratic parties, and, indeed, distorted, as we shall see later, by the foremost theoretician of the Second International, Karl Kautsky. The Communist Manifesto gives a general summary of history which compels us to regard the state as the organ of class rule, and leads us to the inevitable conclusion that the proletariat cannot overthrow the bourgeoisie without first winning political power, without attaining political supremacy, without transforming the state into the proletariat organized as the ruling class, and that the proletarian state, will begin to wither away immediately after its victory, because the state is unnecessary and cannot exist in a society in which there are no class antagonisms. The question as to how, from the point of historical development, the replacement of the bourgeois by the proletarian state is to take place is not raised here. This is the question that Marx raises and answers in 1852. True to his philosophy of dialectical materialism, Marx takes as his basis the historical experience of the great years of revolution, 1848 to 1851. Here, as everywhere else, his theory is a summing up of the experience, illuminated by a profound philosophical conception of the world and a rich knowledge of history. The problem of the state is put specifically. How did the bourgeois state, the state machine necessary for the rule of the bourgeoisie, come into being historically? What changes did it undergo? What evolution did it perform in the course of bourgeois revolutions and in the face of the independent actions of the oppressed classes? What are the tasks of the proletariat in relation to this state machine? The centralized state power that is peculiar to bourgeois society came into being in the period of the fall of absolutism. Two institutions most characteristic of the state machine are the bureaucracy and the standing army. In their works, Marx and Engels repeatedly show that the bourgeoisie are connected with these institutions by thousands of threads. Every worker's experience illustrates this connection in an extremely graphic and impressive manner. From its own bitter experience, the working class learns to recognize this connection. That is why it so easily grasps and firmly and so firmly learns the doctrine which shows the inevitability of this connection, a doctrine which the petty bourgeois Democrats either ignorantly and flippantly deny, or still more, flippantly admit in general, while forgetting to draw the appropriate practical conclusions. The bureaucracy and the standing army are a parasite on the body of the bourgeois society, a parasite created by the internal antagonisms which rend that society, but a parasite which chokes all its vital pores. The Kautskyite opportunism now prevailing in official social democracy considers the view that the state is a parasitic organism to be the peculiar and exclusive attribute of anarchism. It goes without saying that this distortion of Marxism is of vast advantage to those Philistines who have reduced socialism to the unheard of disgrace of justifying and prettyifying the imperialist war by applying it to the concept of defense of the fatherland. But it is unquestionably a distortion, nevertheless. The development, perfection, and strengthening of the bureaucratic and military apparatus proceeded during all the numerous bourgeois revolutions which Europe has witnessed since the fall of feudalism. In particular, it is the petty bourgeois which are attracted to the side of the big bourgeoisie and are largely subordinated to them through this apparatus, which provides the upper sections of the peasants, small artisans, tradesmen, and the like with comparatively comfortable, quiet, and respectable jobs, raising the holders above the people. Consider what happened in Russia during the 6 months following February 27, 1917. The official posts which formerly were given by preference to the Black Hundreds have now become the spoils of the cadets, Mensheviks, and social revolutionaries. Nothing has really thought of introducing any serious reforms. Every effort has been made to put them off until the Constituent Assembly meets, and to steadily put off its convocation until after the war. But there has been no delay, no waiting for the Constituent Assembly in the matter of dividing the spoils, of getting the lucrative jobs of ministers, deputy ministers, governors general, etc., etc. The game of combinations that has been played in forming the government has been, in essence, only an expression of this division and redivision of the spoils which has been going on above and below throughout the country, in every department of central and local government. The 6 months between February 27 and August 27, 1917, can be summed up beyond all dispute as follows: reforms shelved, distribution of official jobs accomplished, and mistakes in the distribution corrected by a few redistributions. But the more the bureaucratic apparatus is redistributed among the various bourgeois and petty bourgeois parties, among the cadets, socialist revolutionaries, and Mensheviks in the case of Russia, the more keenly aware the oppressed classes and the proletariat at their head become of their irreconcilable hostility to the whole of bourgeois society. Hence the need for all bourgeois parties, even for the most democratic and revolutionary democratic among them, to intensify repressive measures against the revolutionary proletariat, to strengthen the apparatus of coercion, i.e. the state machine. This course of events compels the revolution to concentrate all its forces of destruction against the state power and to set itself the aim not of improving the state machine, but of smashing and destroying it. It was not logical reasoning, but the actual developments, the actual experience of 1848 to 1851 that led to the matter of being presented in this way. The extent to which Marx held strictly to the solid ground of historical experience can be seen from the fact that in 1852 he did not yet specifically raise the question of what was to take place of the state machine to be destroyed. Experience has not yet provided material for dealing with this question, which history placed on the agenda later on in 1871. In 1852, all that could be established with the accuracy of scientific observation was that the proletarian revolution had approached the task of concentrating all its forces of destruction against the state power, of smashing the state machine. Here the question may arise: is it correct to generalize the experience, observations, and conclusions of Marx, to apply them to a field that is wider than the history of France during the 3 years 1848 to 1851? Before proceeding to deal with this question, let us recall a remark made by Engels and then examine the facts. In his introduction to the third edition of the 18th Brumaire, Engels wrote, France is the country where, more than anywhere else, the historical class struggles with each time fought out to a finish, and where consequently the changing political forms within which they move and which their results are summarized have been stamped in the sharpest outlines. The center of feudalism in the Middle Ages, the model country since the Renaissance of a unified monarchy based on social estates. France demolished feudalism in the Great Revolution and established the rule of the bourgeoisie in a classical purity unequaled by any other European land. And the struggle of this upward striving proletariat against the ruling bourgeoisie appeared here in an acute form unknown elsewhere. The last remark is out of date insomuch as since 1871 there has been a lull in the revolutionary struggle of the French proletariat, although, long as this lull may be, it does not at all preclude the possibility that in the coming proletarian revolution, France may show herself to be the classic country of the class struggle to a finish. Let us, however, cast a general glance over the history of the advanced countries at the turn of the century. We shall see that the same process went on more slowly in more varied forms in a much wider field. On one hand, the development of parliamentary power both in the republican countries, France, America, Switzerland, and in the monarchist countries, Britain, Germany to a certain extent, Italy, the Scandinavian countries, etc. On the other hand, a struggle for power among the various bourgeois and petty bourgeois parties which distributed and redistributed the spoils of office of the foundations of bourgeois society unchanged, and lastly, the perfection and consolidation of the executive power of its bureaucratic and military apparatus. There is not the slightest doubt that the features are common to the whole of the modern evolution of the all-capitalist states in general. In the last 3 years, 1848 to 1851, France displayed, in a swift, sharp, concentrated form, the very same processes of development which are peculiar to the whole capitalist world. Imperialism, the era of bank capital, the era of gigantic capitalist monopolies, of the development of monopoly capitalism into state monopoly capitalism, has clearly shown an unprecedented growth in its bureaucratic and military apparatus, in connection with the intensification of repressive measures against the proletariat, both in the monarchical and in the freest republican countries. World history is now undoubtedly leading, on the incomparably larger scale than in 1852, the concentration of all the forces of the proletarian revolution on the destruction of the state machine. What the proletariat will put in its place is suggested by the highly instructive material furnished by the Paris Commune. Part 3. The presentation of the question by Marx in 1852. In 1907, Mehring, in the magazine Neue Zeit, published extracts from Marx's letter to Wiedemeyer, dated March 5, 1852. This letter, among other things, contains the following remarkable observation. And now, as to myself, no credit is due to me for discovering the existence of classes in modern society, or the struggle between them. Long before me, bourgeois historians had described the historical development of this class struggle, and bourgeois economists, the economic and anatomy of classes. What I did that was to prove, 1, the existence of classes as only bound up with the particular historical phases in the development of production. 2, that the class struggle necessarily leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat, that this dictatorship itself only constitutes the transition of the abolition of all classes and to a classless society. In these words, Marx succeeded in expressing with striking clarity the chief and radical difference between his theory and that of the foremost and most profound thinkers of the bourgeoisie, and secondly, the essence of his theory of the state. It is often said and written that the main point in Marx's theory is the class struggle, but this is wrong, and this And this wrong notion very often results in an opportunist distortion of Marxism and its falsification in a spirit acceptable to the bourgeoisie. For the theory of class struggle was created not by Marx, but by the bourgeoisie before Marx. And, generally speaking, it is acceptable to the bourgeoisie. Those who recognize only class struggle are not yet Marxists. They may be found to be still within the bounds of bourgeois thinking and bourgeois politics. To confine Marxism to the theory of class struggle means curtailing Marxism, distorting it, reducing it to something acceptable to the bourgeoisie. Only he is a Marxist who extends the recognition of the class struggle to the recognition of the dictatorship of the proletariat. This is what constitutes the most profound distinction between the Marxist and the ordinary petty, as well as big bourgeois. This is the touchstone on which the real understanding and recognition of Marxism should be tested, and it is not surprising that when the history of Europe brought the working class face to face with the question as a practical issue, not only all the opportunists and reformists, but also the Trotskyites, people who vacillate between reformism and Marxism, proved to be miserable Philistines and petty bourgeois Democrats repudiating the dictatorship of the proletariat. Kautsky's pamphlet, The Dictatorship of the Proletariat, published in August 1918, i.e. after the first edition of the present book, is a perfect example why petty bourgeois distortion of Marxism and a base renunciation of it in deeds, while hypocritically recognizing it in words. Yeah, basically that's the end of that. Okay. Opportunism today. Yep. Well, he is a Marxist who withstands the recognition of class struggle to the recognition of the dictator. Yeah. So basically, you can recognize, class struggle, but you have to also recognize that, we're going to get we're going to have a violent revolution, and we're going to have a dictatorship of the proletariat. I think that's basically what he's saying. Okay. Opportunism today, as represented by its principal spokesman, the ex-Marxist Karl Kautsky, fits in completely with Marx's characterization of the bourgeois position quoted above. For this opportunism limits recognition of the class struggle to the sphere of bourgeois relations. Within this sphere, within its framework, not a single educated liberal would refuse to recognize this class struggle in principle. Opportunism does not extend recognition of the class struggle to the cardinal point, to the period of transition from capitalism to communism, of the overthrow and the complete abolition of the bourgeoisie. In reality, this period inevitably is a period of an unprecedentedly violent class struggle in unprecedentedly acute forms, and consequently, during this period, the state must inevitably be a state that is democratic in a new way for the proletariat and the propertyless in general, and dictatorial in a new way against the bourgeoisie. Further, the essence of Marxist theory of the state has been mastered only by those who realize that the dictatorship of a single class is necessary not only for every class society in general, not only for the proletariat which has overthrown the bourgeoisie, but also for the entire historical period which separates capitalism from classless society from communism. Bourgeois states are most varied in form, but their essence is the same. All these states, whatever their form in the final analysis, are inevitably the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. The transition from capitalism to communism is certainly bound to yield a tremendous abundance and variety of political forms, but the essence will inevitably be the same, the dictatorship of the proletariat. Well, should we move on to chapter 3? Should we? I don't know. Let's go ahead and see what we can do here. Let's at least get through part 1. Let's see how, part 1 isn't too long. Okay. It is well, so chapter 3 is Experience of the Paris Commune of 1871, Marx's Analysis. Part 1, What Made the Communards Attempt Heroic? It is well known that in the autumn of 1870, a few months before the Commune, Marx warned that warned the Paris workers that any attempt to overthrow the government would be a folly of despair. But when, in March 1871, a decisive battle was forced upon the workers, and they accepted it, when the uprising had become a fact, Marx greeted the proletarian revolution with the greatest enthusiasm in spite of unfavorable auguries. Marx did not persist in the pedantic attitude of condemning an untimely movement, as did the ill-famed Russian renegade from Marxism, Plekhanov, who in November 1905 wrote encouragingly about the workers' and peasants' struggle, but after December 1905 cried liberal fashion they should not have taken up arms. Yeah, that's how a lot of people are. Marx, however, was not only enthusiastic about the heroism of the communards who, as he expressed it, stormed heaven. Although the mass revolutionary movement did not achieve its aim, he regarded it as a historic experience of enormous importance, as a certain advance of the world's proletarian revolution, as a practical step that was more important than hundreds of programs and arguments. Marx endeavored to analyze this experiment, to draw tactical lessons from it, and re-examine his theory in the light of it. The only correction Marx thought it necessary to make to the Communist Manifesto he made on the basis of the revolutionary experience of the Paris Commune. The last preface to the new German edition of the Communist Manifesto, signed by both its authors, is dated June 24th, 1872. In its preface, the authors, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, say that the program of the Communist Manifesto has in some details been come out of date. And they go on to say, one thing especially was proved by the Commune, that the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes. The authors took the words that are in single quotation marks in the passage from Marx's book, The Civil War in France. Thus, Marx and Engels regarded one principal and fundamental lesson of the Paris Commune as being of such enormous importance that they introduced it as an important correction into the Communist Manifesto. Most characteristically, it is the important correction that has been distorted by the opportunists, and its meaning probably is not known to the 9/10, if not the 99/100 of the readers of the Communist Manifesto. We shall deal with this distortion more fully farther on, in a chapter devoted specifically to the two distortions. Here it will be sufficient to note that the current vulgar interpretation of Marx's famous statement just quoted is that Marx here allegedly emphasizes the idea of slow development in contradiction to the seizure of power and so on. As a matter of fact, the exact opposite is the case. Marx's idea is that the working class must break up, smash the ready-to-made state machinery, and not confine itself merely to laying hold of it. On April 12, 1871, i.e., just at the time of the Commune, Marx wrote to Kugelmann, "If you look up to the last chapter of my 18th Brumaire, you will find that I declare that the next attempt of the French Revolution will be no longer, as before, to transfer the bureaucratic military machine from one hand to another, but to smash it." Marx's italics, the original is Zerbrechen. And this is the precondition for every real people's revolution on the continent. And this is what our heroic party comrades in Paris are attempting. The letters of Marx to Kugelmann have appeared in Russian in no less than 2 editions, one of which I edited and supplied with a preface. The words "to smash the bureaucratic military machine" briefly express the principal lesson of Marxism regarding the tasks of the proletariat during a revolution in relation to the state. And this is the lesson that has been not only completely ignored, but positively distorted by the prevailing Kautskyite interpretation of Marxism. As for Marx's reference to the 18th Brumaire, we have quoted the relevant passage in full above. It is interesting to note, in particular, 2 points in the above-quoted argument of Marx. First, he restricts his conclusion to the continent. This was understandable in 1871, when Britain was still the model of a purely capitalist country, but without a militarist clique, and to a considerable degree without a bureaucracy. Marx therefore excluded Britain, where a revolution, even a people's revolution, then deemed possible, and indeed was possible, without the precondition of destroying ready-made state machinery. Today, in 1917, at the time of the First Great Imperialist War, this restriction made by Marx is no longer valid. Both Britain and America, the biggest and the last representatives in the world of Anglo-Saxon liberty, in the sense that they had no militarist cliques, and the bureaucracy have completely sunk into the all-European filthy, bloody morass of bureaucratic military institutions which subordinate everything to themselves and suppress everything. Today, in Britain and America too, the precondition for every real people's revolution is smashing the destruction of the ready-made state machinery, made and brought up to the European general imperialist perfection of those countries in the years of 1914 to 1917. Secondly, particular attention should be paid to Marx's extremely profound remark that the destruction of the bureaucratic military state machine is the precondition for every real people's revolution. The idea of a people's revolution seems strange coming from Marx, so that the Russian Plekhanovites and Mensheviks, those followers of Struve who wish to be regarded as Marxists, might possibly declare such an expression to be a slip of the pen on Marx's part. They have reduced Marxism to such a state of wretchedly liberal distortion that nothing exists for them beyond the antithesis between bourgeois revolution and proletarian revolution. And even this antithesis they interpret it in an utterly lifeless way. If we take the revolutions of the 20th century as examples, we shall, of course, have to admit that the Portuguese and Turkish revolutions are both bourgeois revolutions. Neither of them, however, is a people's revolution, since in neither does the mass of the people, the vast majority, come out actively, independently, with their own economic and political demands to any noticeable degree. By contrast, although the Russian bourgeois revolution of 1905 to 1907 displayed no such brilliant successes as at times fell to the Portuguese and Turkish revolutions, it was undoubtedly a real people's revolution, since the mass of the people, their majority, the very lowest social groups, crushed by oppression and exploitation, rose independently and stamped out the entire course of the revolution, the imprint of their own demands, their attempt to build in their own way a new society in place of the old society that was being destroyed. In Europe in 1871, the proletariat did not constitute the majority of the people in any country on the continent. A people's revolution, one actually sweeping the majority into its stream, could be such only if it embraced both the proletariat and the peasants. These two classes then constituted the people. These two classes are united by the fact that the bureaucratic military state machine oppresses, crushes, exploits them. To smash this machine, to break it up, is truly in the interest of the people, of their majority, of the workers, and most of the peasants, is the precondition for a free alliance of the poor peasant and the proletarians. Whereas without such an alliance, democracy is unstable and socialist transformation is impossible. As is well known, the Paris Commune was actually working its way towards such an alliance, although it did not reach its goal owing to a number of circumstances, internal and external. Consequently, in speaking of a real people's revolution, Marx, without in the least discounting the special features of the petty bourgeois, he spoke a great deal about them and often took strict account of the actual balance of class forces in most of the continental countries of Europe in 1871. On the other hand, he stated that the smashing of the state machine was required by the interests of both the workers and peasants, that it united them. Then it placed before them the common task of removing the parasite and of replacing it by something new. By what exactly? Part 2. What is to replace the smashed state machine? In 1847, the Communist Manifesto, Marx's answer to this question was as yet a purely abstract one, to be exact. It was an answer that indicated tasks, but not the ways of accomplishing them. The answer given in the Communist Manifesto was that this machine was to be replaced by the proletariat organized as the ruling class, by the winning of the battle of democracy. Marx did not indulge in utopias. He expected the experience of the mass movement to provide the reply to the question as to the specific forms this organization of the proletariat as the working class would assume, as to the exact manner in which this organization would be combined with the most complete, most consistent winning of the battle of democracy. Marx subjected the experience of the Commune, meager as it was, to the most careful analysis in the Civil War in France. Okay. All right. You know what? I think we're going to call it there because I do have some other things to try to get done. So we're going to try to finish it up. I know I kind of ended it on a big point there, but I'm going to end it there. I do appreciate that one person sticking around, but I do need to save the time since I'm doing this for free. But yeah, so we're going to try to finish this up. Probably, I'll see what time left I have on my free account here, so we're going to keep it there. But I do appreciate y'all listening for about an hour. I know this is a lot to listen to, but I appreciate that other person coming in. So we're going to end it here, but I hope y'all have a good night. See you later.